Everyone to this important panel discussion on scaling up adaptation finance for climate resilience. We've had very enriching discussions so far on enhanced and informed investments in resilient infrastructure. This session promises to be no different, and we aim to, through this session, coalesce stakeholder input to generate valuable, actionable insights that can be translated into concrete actions and recommendations for scaling up climate resilient infrastructure specific adaptation financing. So we have with us a very distinguished panel drawn from multilateral banks, governments, development agencies, and also most crucially, private sector. So to discuss, how designing bankable infrastructure resilience projects becomes, becomes important given the context of fast-changing climate. So I now pass on the floor to my moderator for the session, Mr. Ashish Kulkarni, to take the proceedings forward. Ashish Kulkarni is partner and associate director, the Boston Consulting Group, India. Ashish has 24 years of experience in climate change across different geographies with public, private, and financial institutions. He's helped institutions raise close to around 500 million US dollars in climate financing and actively formulating solutions for adaptation and resilience financing. Over to Ashish. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thanks to CDRI for actually bringing this important topic to life. And with all the all the hard work that has gone, I would really first thank, especially the DG Amit Prothi and wonderful team of Ranjini, Avinash, and for having invited us to co-curate this panel and have all the panelists. This is a topic which, in fact, the more we speak, it needs to get into action. And the entire panel over here, which today the aim is to get into action. And how are we going to do it? By creating ecosystems. So the entire focus will be on identifying all the stakeholders involved, and we'll try and get a flavor of understanding what needs to be done, and some best practices and some success stories also will be shared so that we can all learn from each other and try to get into implementation. That's the main agenda of the panel. We do have a very distinguished set of panelists, and I would call upon our panelists now, starting with we do have with us Mr. Auguste Tano Combi. He's taken over the World Bank's country directorship, and I would like to invite him. He is most recently served as World Bank country director for Republic of Turkey. Prior to this, he served as director of World Bank Group's independent evaluation group. He also held positions as practice manager in the macroeconomics and fiscal management practice of the World Bank, first in Latin America and Caribbean countries, and then in the Middle East and North Africa region. Welcome, Auguste, to this panel. We do have Walters De Simone from Brazil. He has joined us virtually, I believe. We do expect him to join. Hi, Walter. How are you doing? Yeah. So,
good morning.
Walter has over 15 years of experience in climate policy with a focus on subnational policies. He has previously worked as director of Political Coordination and Dialogue at the Talmoa Institute, Coordinator of Climate at Cities at WRI, Brazil, and Superintendent of Green Economy of the state of Rio de Janeiro. Thanks, Walter, for joining. And we then have Deepa from Fiji. And Deepa she is a Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisor for Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, Fiji. Deepa holds a PhD in Environmental Science from Northwest University, South Africa, and undertook a postdoctoral research fellowship from Rhodes University. She's published 2 books and several journal articles, and has 20 years work experience in the field of climate change, environmental management, spanning multiple countries and sectors. She also contributes to the globally sustainable discourse and action as the honorary co-director of Global Research Network Sustainable Futures Global. Welcome, Deepa. Next, we do have Sujit Mohanty from UNDRR. Sujit has 20 years of experience of disaster risk management. He knows only that, and he comes with a huge experience which we all will benefit from on how to look at climate resilience financing. His experience spans across humanitarian coordination, development, and climate change. He's worked with UNOCHA, UNDP, and now with the UNDRR. He has previously held positions as head of regional platform coordinator for UNDRR Asia Pacific offices in Bangkok, Thailand, and he has also served as chief technical advisor for risk information systems in Sri Lanka, and he's worked in India as well on information systems. He holds a PhD in media and governance and masters in business administration and computer science. Thank you for joining us. We have with us Gaetano Vibo, who's the Director General of ECHO, European Commission. Gaetano is Deputy Head of the Unit Prevention and Preparedness Capacity Building at the European Commission's Director General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Operations. He has 20 years of experience working on disaster and climate resilience, including post-disaster and crisis situation. Before joining the European Commission in May 2016, Gaetano worked as a disaster risk management specialist for the World Bank, where he was team leader for investment projects in several Latin American and Caribbean countries. Thank you, Gaetano, for joining in. And we have with us Savina, who is from ICSI. She's the Executive Director of International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, and she's an experienced civil engineer and infrastructure a practitioner for almost 2 decades, and her experience spans advising governments, infrastructure owners and operators, multi-development banks and NGOs to develop and implement inclusive, sustainable and resilient infrastructure that is fit for the future. Thanks, Savina, for joining in. So a stellar panel, and we will begin with the keynote address from Auguste. Over to you.
From here. Thank you very much, Ashish. Distinguished participant in this very important session on scaling up adaptation finance for climate resilience. It's really a pleasure to give the keynote speech here. But before starting, let me thank Director General CDRI, Mr. Amit Pruthi, for putting together this very important event, and for your leadership of CDRI. It's impressive how CDRI has grown over the past few years since its creation, and we are very pleased to have been a partner of CDRI since its inception, and we're looking forward to continue working with you to grow your mandate, your membership, and your footprints. We know that climate change is upon us. We know that the Paris Agreement has helped us collectively focus a little bit more on effort to reduce global warming, but we also know that our efforts at a global community are falling short of helping ensure that we reach the 1.5-degree goal. So we're headed toward a 2-degree goal, and perhaps even worse. And we know that this will have serious consequences for us, for our communities, for our infrastructure. We therefore need to prepare. We understand that if we head toward a 2-degree scenario, as many as 4 billion people who are already living in regions affected by climate change will be worse off. We think at the World Bank that climate change alone will push more than 100 million people into poverty by 2030. And this number could be higher. Disaster-triggered climate-related hazards are costing countries billions, and it could reach trillions if we're not proactive. It is estimated that by 2050, as many as 143 million people would become climate migrant. We know that already in South Asia, 33 million people are displaced because of the impact of climate change. So these numbers are staggering, but importantly, they affect people, they affect lives, and they actually could negate the effort that we're all putting into creating or eliminating poverty and boosting shared prosperity on a livable planet. At the World Bank, we're very focused on ensuring that the numbers that I've shared with you either get reduced or averted. So we heard earlier that we need to move into action. What I would like to do today in the few minutes that I'm given is to give you some thoughts on how we think we can all move very quickly into action. The principles for resilient infrastructure have been developed already. They were developed by ICDRI to help implement the Sendai framework for disaster reduction. So we do have a framework already. We've had it for about 10 years. We have not fully implemented it. So now we need to acknowledge that over the past 10 years, the infrastructure gap has increased. Countries need more infrastructure for development. We need to acknowledge that the financing gap has increased. As our development needs increase, the financing gap increase. We also need to acknowledge that the quality gaps has increased as we have been building infrastructures that are not really resilient. And then we need to recognize that we have not brought everybody to the table, especially the private sector, for resilience financing. And we need to acknowledge that we have not pulled together all the strings of the economy. We have not incorporated resilience really as everybody's business, or we have not had a whole of society approach. So let me take these issues in order. First, on the financing gap, or rather, let me actually start on the infrastructure gap. It is noted in a 2016 report that 90 trillion investment in infrastructure will be needed over the next 15 years. So this is a huge number. How do we ensure that we build these infrastructure for the future? how do we ensure that what is already built is resilient? This will require a lot of money, but also a lot of knowledge, which CDRI is providing. On the financing side, we at the World Bank, recognizing our role as a financial institution, want to increase the share of our financing that goes to adaptation. Overall, we want climate financing to represent 45% of our financing, and we want half of that to go toward adaptation. We also want to help countries have space in their own budget to meet adaptation needs, especially when disasters hit. So we have introduced the climate resilient debt clauses especially for small island countries, so that they have space to focus on adaptation and especially during shocks. We are also providing direct financing to help mobilize private capital, and I'll come to it in a minute. On the private sector side, what I found very staggering is some numbers that I got looking at how the private sector itself sees these issues. The private sector thinks that the adaptation market is worth, or could be worth, $2 trillion, and they're not capturing it. They discussed it at COP27 under the leadership of the World Economic Forum. So they want to capture part of this $2 trillion economy. And they realize that the conditions for them to do so are not totally in their hands. The government has to play a role. They recognize that so far, private financing has represented only 1.6% of the financing that goes into adaptation. So the market is huge, and they're waiting to take advantage of it. We have recognized internally in the World Bank that it is right for the private sector to expect high return on their adaptation investment. But for that high return to come in, there is a need for the public financing to be used to de-risk the investment in adaptation, to accelerate the time frame for the return on private investment to materialize. There is also a need for regulations and frameworks to be in place so that losses are mitigated or limited. So whilst we work at the World Bank to provide direct financing, we are also working to use our limited resources to put in place what is needed for the private sector to come in, to de-risk. So we use some of our guarantees to provide, to do that. We use some of our financing also to help reduce the cost of direct investment on the public sector side, so the public sector investment can come in and mobilize private investment through shared infrastructure, for example. But we want to go beyond that, and we think as a global community we need to go beyond that. And going beyond that means two additional points that I would like to make before closing. One is recognizing that adaptation is everybody's business. We will need to mainstream it in the way we do business, in the public sector especially. So for example, in India, we've been working with the government of Kerala to incorporate the notion of adaptation into how budgets are prepared, how development policies are prepared, and how strategies are prepared across the spectrum of economic activities. Doing this can reduce the cost of direct financing for adaptation, because it means everything that is done in a way that is strong, so we don't need to wait for it to be destroyed to build back better. We can build well from inception. We can avoid spending money on things that will not add to our overall resilience, may add to something but not our resilience, and therefore it may not have a high return in the long term. We also need to mainstream adaptation into how sectors that are traditionally not seen as part of the conversation embrace the notion of adaptation. So for example, social sectors, schools, hospitals, they will need to embrace the notion of adaptation and resilience so that when they operate, and not just through infrastructure construction, but just how the systems operate so that they're resilient, so they can use technology, for example, to ensure business continuity when disasters hit and infrastructures are locked into non-operative modes. So this notion of mainstreaming adaptation is, we think, an important part of how we should address this challenge of adaptation going forward. The second important strand of thinking that we want to put on the table squarely is the notion of measuring and tracking progress. You know, adaptation and disasters are seen as emergency. So they hit, we respond, and we wait for the next disasters to hit and we respond. And, you know, there is a sort of tradition of preparing for the next shock, which is good. We need to prepare for the next shock. But we also need to measure how we have done in past shocks. And we need to build data on our response system so we can learn across. And to me, this is very apt to talk about here because CDRI mandate is on knowledge sharing, capacity building. And to do that, we need data, we need to learn, we need to have lessons. So I will argue, I hope in today's panel we'll talk about how we are learning from past experiences and how we're generating data in other countries to use in countries where CDRI operates. To close, let me say that we're facing unprecedented climate change shocks, which goes without saying. At the World Bank, we recognize that financing is part of the story, especially for infrastructure construction, but it's not the only part. We need to ensure that we boost financing, but we also need to ensure that we do mainstream adaptation into a whole of government, a whole of society approach. We need to ensure that on the financing side, we put private sector squarely as part of the discussion and become a stakeholder in it. And we need to ensure that the limited public resources that we use are geared toward stimulating more financing into adaptation. And finally, I should like to congratulate CDRI on the effort to expand its membership. And we at the World Bank, will be very supportive of helping you expand even further so that your advocacy role, your capacity building role can benefit more countries. With that, and perhaps having taken perhaps too much time, I would like to pause here and looking forward to learning from the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Auguste. And you highlighted quite a few main focus points for the panel, and you've guided us, and thank you so much for that. One of the key things which came up is the kind of infrastructure financing that is getting into all the developing countries. And basically, if you're saying that $90 trillion are getting into the infrastructure system, it needs to be climate resilient. So you talk about infrastructure in a very, when we talk about infrastructure, we look at hard infrastructure, but there is also the soft infrastructure, the digital infrastructure. We just heard in the last panel about the telecom infrastructure and how it is getting affected by all that's happening due to climate change. And so in my personal opinion, every dollar coming out of the next dollar should be climate resilient financing. And I think if we move into thinking in those terms, I think the mainstreaming word would go away in some time, and all financing will become resilient adaptation related financing towards any infrastructure that is created. Thank you so much for your guidance for the panel. Yeah, so we now move on to Gaetano. I think Gaetano has a in-person meeting after this. He's busy man, and let's hear from him on the European Commission's work. And there's a lot of work which, as the ECO, you're doing in encouraging countries in Europe to enhance their investments for disaster and climate resilience with evidence-based knowledge and financial assistance provided to civil protection and disaster risk management authorities. Could you give us some examples on how the Commission is doing this work and what are the kind of key stakeholders, which we need? What we are trying to also build through this panel is to have that ecosystem right for encouraging more investment. So your views, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashish. Good morning, everybody. Um, Indeed, I'm based in Brussels. I regret not being able to be there with you today. And first of all, I want to thank CDRI for inviting me in this panel. Uh, my name is Gaetano Vivo. I work for the European Commission department that deals with civil protection and disaster risk management. And since 2013, so a little more than 10 years, we have a framework of cooperation in Europe called the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. This mechanism brings together our 27 EU member states and 10 other countries in Europe. um, our main counterparts are civil protection authorities and disaster risk management agencies, with a goal to increase Europe's collective resilience to disasters and crises by preventing and preparing for their potential impacts. And of course, among these crises and disasters, we also include those one who are caused by climate change. Our mandate is enshrined in the EU treaty, which gives us a support role to our member states. This is an important thing to highlight. We do not have the primary role in prevention and preparedness in European countries. This is a national prerogative. But what we do from the EU is to support our member states in prevention, preparedness, and response. Now, when we talk of disaster response, of course, it's a bit more straightforward. We have a shared pool of disaster response assets, which any country that is overwhelmed by a disaster can mobilize by activating our mechanism. So that's quite straightforward. However, when it comes to preventing, and which also includes adapting to climate change and preparing for, so slightly more long-term type of investments, it gets more challenging. Because as we know, making prevention, disaster prevention, a priority is a challenge for policymakers, for the political level of decision making, because often they don't see the benefits of this type of investments, as something that they can, uh, you know, uh, easily communicate to their constituency. It's much easier to take a picture of a Canadair plane dropping water on a wildfire than investing in a forestry management or other fuel breaks type of investment for wildfire prevention, just to give a very simple example. So we have this problem between to convince decision makers to prioritize investments, and this misperception of low frequency, low probability disaster versus more urgent, immediate challenges. So this is one of the probably the first and the most fundamental challenge we face here, and how we're trying to deal with that. We are producing evidence, arguments that are easily understood by the political level, by the decision makers, and that can translate in, with numbers, the benefits that we can get from investing in disaster prevention and climate adaptation. To do that, we partner with the World Bank. In 2021, we released a report, which you will find online. It's called The Economics for Disaster Prevention and Preparedness. This report um, builds on nearly 80 investments of multi-hazard, so several also climate-related hazards. So it builds on evidence, concrete investments, and it uh, provides the benefit-cost ratio for them. Using an approach which is probably many of you know is called the triple dividend of resilience. The interesting part of this approach is that it it provides figures also for benefits which go beyond the avoided losses. Benefits such as the economic value that this kind of prevention investment can unlock, by increasing the value of land, of or housing or built environment that is more resilient to disasters, and the co-benefits such as ecosystem services, CO2 emissions that are captured by solutions such as nature-based uh, solutions or other type of green prevention measures. So the important aspect of the big news, the good news of this type of assessment is that benefits for this type of investments materialize regardless of whether a disaster happens or not, which hopefully will help us address the concern of several decision makers in governments, which understandably have a lot of priorities to choose from, and disaster prevention, climate adaptation is one of them. So with this evidence today, we can say that flood investments that integrate nature-based solutions and early warnings in Europe uh, provide benefits up to 14 times the cost, or that earthquake prevention measures, when they are combined with energy efficiency intervention to modernize public buildings, provide benefits up to 4.8 times the cost. So for every euro invested in this, the return is up to 5 euros. So all these examples are based on European case studies, and that's really important for us because we often see these numbers, but they come from the US, from Japan, but now we have Europe-specific evidence. And just as to give you a last example, heat wave early warning systems. So we know heat waves is the silent killer. There's huge economic impact and social impact on health sector, on the industrial sector. €1 invested in for heat wave early warning systems delivers up to 131 euros in return. So this is what we are doing to make the case. But making the case is important to educate the politician, the decision makers. However, it's also not enough because we know that government budgets are increasingly under pressure. And as I said, prevention and climate adaptation is one of several priorities that our governments have to deal with. So we want to now help them by providing methods and tools to prioritize investments given limited budget. So we are actually about to launch on the 15th of May a second phase of this study. And among other things, this second piece of work will help countries spotlight critical infrastructure for disaster risk management, for emergency response. So we'll give some concrete methods to do that. Because indeed, recent catastrophic events in Europe reveal that there are still blind spots in critical sectors that provide emergency response services. And when this infrastructure fails, when critical evacuation routes are flooded, when hospitals need to be evacuated due to a wildfire, human lives cannot be saved, and the impact of an event becomes even more important. So this next piece of work that we'll launch on the 15th of May will give our policymakers and our decision makers some criteria, some methods to prioritize these investments, starting with civil protection and emergency management infrastructure. I know that we are running out, we're a bit late, and I will try to be short, but I wanted to point to some of the policy recommendations that this work is leading us to. And of course, I'll be happy to hear from you and engage with you on how we can collaborate. First, we need to focus on resilient critical infrastructure. We need to, starting with civil protection and emergency response sector, we need to make that a priority in policy and strategic investment frameworks. We have to make sure that when we start from this strategic framework, this type of infrastructure upgrading and maintenance has to rank very high. Second, we need to promote and fund research into critical sector. to fill data and knowledge gap. Still today, there's a lot of information gap about the condition of critical assets and the performance of this critical infrastructure in a given disaster scenario here in Europe. So we need to invest in funding, research, and fill these data gaps. Third, we need to make use of available tools and methods to prioritize decisions in a way to maximize benefits. And I gave some examples about that. Fourth, we need to we need dedicated funds for upgrading, replacing, and maintaining critical infrastructure. We do offer through our program technical assistance funds, and we have seen that our constituency, our civil protection and disaster risk management agencies can use this fund to leverage through much larger investment funds of the EU, but also of the World Bank and other donors investment. So this link between seed funding to fill knowledge gaps, to prepare investments, and then scaling them up through bigger funds is critical, and we need to keep that. And fifth and last, we need a truly whole of society effort. This goes way beyond the responsibility of government only. We need to involve the private sector. We know that there are huge financing gaps which with public budgets will not be able to address. My final conclusion is that in the European Commission, we are very interested in learning from other regions, from other partners worldwide, on how are you managing to tackle these challenges, and particularly which arguments, which strategies you're using to make these investments and a priority, and how you have been managed to convince decision makers in these countries to invest more in the resilience of critical infrastructure. With that, I want to thank you again, and I look forward to discussing further with you.
Thanks, Gaetano, and best wishes for your meeting. Thank you for your time, and you brought in the focus to the language which the policymakers actually would like to hear, and one of the key things is on the cost of inaction, which you brought out. I think that's the key to accelerate more infrastructure, climate resilient financing, and I think this is one of the key important recommendations, I think, which we could take forward from here as well, and bringing in all the best practices across the globe. There's lots of work which is happening on this to bring it all together in one place, and CDRI as a platform, I think we could utilize, all of us, to bring that in. And I think one of the key things also which Gaetano said, and yesterday there was a panel discussion on disaster risk financing as well, and some of those aspects you were very well brought in, but there was one key element of tracking the benefits of these interventions and this financing which is going in. I think tracking, if we do it well, it can be then percolated as an information to policymakers, which will then lead to building in the resilience financing within the infrastructure financing and within the budgets, as Auguste also delivered in his opening remarks. I think all of this will come together. Thank you so much. We now move to Walter. Walter, you have from the experience that you have, especially the focus should, from the perspective of public finance, what are your views on how to integrate adaptation and resilience financing within the public finance? And that is something that we would like to hear from you, Walter. Over to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I wish I was there in person. Unfortunately, we couldn't get there on time. It is 4 a.m. here in Brazil, so hopefully I'm coherent enough for everybody to understand. I have a couple of slides to share very, very briefly, hopefully to tell you a little bit about what is happening in Brazil and what it is exactly that it's been showing us on what is that we need to do and how to look at public finance and what does that review in terms of governance and the challenges that a developing country like Brazil with massive infrastructure needs to look into. So just a quick overview of Brazil. Brazil is developing its national adaptation plan. We still don't have one. We're updating it. The previous one wasn't implemented. Continental proportions of a country. We have 5 different biomes, 27 states, over 5,500 municipalities. Brazil's a federation, so it has a complex governance required to tackle any kind of policy implementation in general. And when we look into these states and these regions, we see that they're not very ready to take adaptation seriously from a planning perspective. Only 4 states have adaptation plans, and only 1 state has an adaptation fund. In a country where over the past decade we've had more than 9 million people displaced due to climate events, hundreds of thousands of injuries and thousands of deaths as well. Parallel to this, and every time we talk about climate, especially in a country like Brazil, we have to understand what are the other major policies that are being implemented and not necessarily connected to climate change. And Brazil has something called the PAC, the Accelerated Growth Program. It's a 1.7 trillion reais program, which is about $330 billion that was announced by the current government that would finance infrastructure, most importantly, from 2023 to 2026, bringing about a mix from federal and state funding, private sector, and other sources of public finance. And this was the country's major bet and bid to say, this is how we're going to fill the infrastructure gap, and this is how we're going to focus on infrastructure. And I'm not going to go over all of this, but you find over 25 different areas that we're going to look into. And when asked about adaptation and how adaptation was going to feature into this, there's one answer, which is we're going to look into disaster prevention, and we're going to look at hillside stabilization and drainage programs within a very complex and massive and ambitious infrastructure program that would look into the whole country. This graph becomes a bit silly when we look into what percentage of the total budget would go into adaptation according to the lexicon or the taxonomy that was being used. And it was about 2.1 billion out of 1.7 trillion. So clearly there's a challenge and there's an issue that we need to look into and that Brazil needs to take care of. There's a couple of key actors that have been deeply involved in learning how to ensure that adaptation funds infrastructure properly around Brazil. The first one is BNDES. It's the Brazilian National Development Bank. They only now are starting to do specific funding for adaptation projects that are actively looking into infrastructure and adaptation, and are looking for states that have their adaptation plans. They decided that this is going to be a big differential, so more and more they're nudging states in the right direction. Brazil also has state development banks, and these state development banks are a major player on financing local governments. They're channeling part of this PAC, the PAC funding. They're closer to municipalities. They can respond to the specific needs of local governments, and they're working with commercial banks more closely. They're being able to set the tone on how this money that is trickling down and this funding that is trickling down is going to arrive in different localities and different territories. And more recently, we have a new player that is starting to talk about adaptation properly, which are the insurance companies. All PAC projects are insured. They are more and more realizing that the insurance that they're doing is a bad deal for them, because most of these projects do not take adaptation and resilience into account. A lot of the projects that are being funded and financed that are expected to last for 50 years, several decades, are only going to last for 5 to 10 years, according to some of the studies that have been done. Some of the infrastructure housing, for instance, or the key infrastructure like bridges or logistics, is being placed in areas that will put people and goods and services and industries at risk because they are not taking adaptation into account. And it has become very clear into all of these debates that one of the biggest chokeholds in all of this are the municipalities themselves. Brazil, as I mentioned, 5,500, about 3,600 of them have less than 20,000 people. They're the ones that are most vulnerable. They're the ones that need the most finance, and they're not ready to implement adaptation projects. And they're not ready to talk about infrastructure finance in a way that is different from what they have been doing for the past 50, 60 years or so. So the debate that we have right now is going around, 5 of these topics, and I call it findings because a lot of the studies are still coming out, and I'm not going to quote any studies on this. This is part of the debate that is going on. First one is that, funding adaptation is a local, territorial, and grounded approach. It is very difficult to treat it as a federal, national issue without understanding the peculiarities of each region in Brazil. And much more so, it is very hard to move along with funding adaptation infrastructure without involving local communities. This is more and more a request. This is more and more part of the movements and the civil society organizations that are, building themselves around these topics. And many of them have realized after many years of, dealing with climate issues that adaptation is the topic that is most important and the more relevant to them. We do need clearer policy guidelines and standards. They need to be set, but they do need to come from the top. They need to come from the federal government. We need things like not only an adaptation plan, but we need a common taxonomy to understand what does adaptation finance actually mean within the context of infrastructure. When I showed those 25 areas that PAC looks into, there's clearly several of them that are actually adaptation. If we understand adaptation in broader terms, and if we understand that if we don't shift, as it has been mentioned many times before, all of our funding and the way that we look into infrastructure as a whole, we need a clearer guideline. We need a clearer taxonomy to be able to talk about this. And we need to take a more regional approach. This is something that we have found out in Brazil. Small municipalities are going to have a hard time implementing these projects. So states or provinces, they need to come in and help figure this out. How can we bundle projects up? How can we have layers of maps and analysis that will help provide the information that is needed to the public finance actors, through the commercial banks, through the insurance companies in order to bring these projects into fruition. It's easier to work with 27 actors than with 5,500, and it's impossible to work with several of the smaller ones. So we need to find these key actors and help them set up better structures to help this funding flow from federal to local. We talked enough about additional versus shifting, and I won't talk more about this, but what's better, right? 2.1 billion or 1.7 trillion? We need to ensure that it's more about the 1.7 trillion than it is about the 2.1 billion. But this requires a level of conversation and a level of awareness that, piggybacking to what Gaetano mentioned, we need to make this a political issue, and we need to make sure that cost of inaction, a lot of these numbers come up, and then we mobilize a lot of the decision makers in order to be paying attention to this. And last but not least, and this is one of those issues that come up, we have a lot of money to build bridges. We don't have enough money to capacity build a municipality to take in an adaptation project, understand what it is, implement the infrastructure project from beginning to end, and ensure that it just exists after a couple of years. How can we build and bring in additional funding, most likely public funding, that will help us bridge this capacity gap, which once again, it is identified as the biggest issue for implementing a lot of these projects on large scale in Brazil. I've talked for about 10 minutes. I'm sorry for going a little bit over time. Hopefully I'll stay around. I'll see and we're able to have a nice chat about this, and hopefully we can talk more about this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Walter, and this was a great presentation, and some of the things which you really brought out was echoed quite a lot in yesterday's disaster risk financing as well, and the aspect of taxonomy, which is most important, I think. First, COP after COP, we just need to resolve the climate finance taxonomy, which should include all the taxonomies which we really need. This is something that, of course, Brazil holds the presidency for G20, and I think you would be also, discussing this over there in the coming days. But having said that, I think, specific funding and the leveraging of public finance is most important. I think the first buck stops with the public finance coming in and then bringing in the other actors. The way the fund was created, having a blend of private sector as well as others, is something that can be replicated elsewhere. It's a great start with 1.7 trillion, but more needs to be done. And also insurance. I think there's a lot of aspects on parametric insurance, which again could lead to many specific local related products which can come out, and that's again tying back to the fact that which you mentioned about the action on adaptation being local. So we will have to figure a way out of how to transform it and make it much more scalable. We'll have to find out we'll have to just connect the dots and get it right, which you have done. And thank you so much for your presentation, Walter. I know that we are a little bit away from the main schedule, but we do have some time. I don't want to eat the entire time from the lunch, which is preceding this panel. So we have 3 more speakers. We have, now I would like to call upon Deepa, and followed by Savina, and we will end with Sujit because he knows everything about this, and we will wait to hear him have the last word on this panel. So Sujit, you'll have to wait for some time, but over to you, Deepa. So Deepa, you work in Fiji, and the country is affected by sea level rise and extreme weather events. So I would like to know your views on how your government and you being in the ministry are thinking on these aspects, and how you're integrating and mainstreaming adaptation, resilience, finance in whatever you're doing. Over to you, Deepa.
Thank you, Ashish. So when you hear of Fiji, most of you must be visualizing a tropical paradise, which it is. But the sobering reality is that it's also consistently been in the top 15 countries in the world that is vulnerable to disasters and also vulnerable to sea level rise. It's an archipelago of 330 islands, out of which 110 are permanently inhabited. And most of the infrastructure is in the low-lying areas, in the coastal areas. And 75% of people live there. And Fiji has a cyclone season between November to April, where it is hit by multiple cyclones, which cause damage to infrastructure. In 2016, we had Cyclone Winston, which wiped out 1/3 of Fiji's GDP overnight. So that's the kind of scale of infrastructure damage that happens from disasters. In addition to that, Fiji also has the challenge of aging infrastructure. Some of Fiji's ports are over 100 years old, and some of the water, the utility infrastructure, water treatment facility, wastewater treatment facilities have reached their end of life. So all of this, flooding, sea level rise, storm surges, cyclones, landslides, all of this has impacts on human livelihoods, food security, water security, trade, economy, and health as well. So some of the critical infrastructure, health clinics, there are about 31 identified for relocation due to sea level rise. Areas of cultural importance. The Pacific is a fantastic country, rich in culture. Areas of cultural importance are getting lost because of this. Graves are getting submerged underwater. So to address these challenges, what is Fiji doing? A number of things, and here I will just highlight 3. So nature-based solutions, use of Earth observation data, and innovative financing. In terms of nature-based solutions, Fiji has included this into its National Adaptation Plan, NDC, the National Development Plan, the National Infrastructure Investment Plans, and has really started implementing projects using that. And one example I can give is nature-based seawalls. So Fiji has received support from ADB and other development partners to design nature-based seawalls, which look like a line of mangrove forests followed by a line of boulders, which are contributed by the community, and then a line of soil, which is stabilized by vetiver grass, and then the actual gray infrastructure that is built. And this has multiple benefits because it provides biodiversity benefits, it provides habitats for marine life, it's cost effective because they use locally available materials. The community is part of the construction and the maintenance, so mangrove nurseries are set up during the project, and when the project staff exit, it's the community that continue maintaining all of that. And also the gray infrastructure that is built can be of multiple use. It can be built as a road or a recreational area or designed properly to enhance fishing and so on. And also not to mention the carbon sequestration benefits. Then the other point is the use of Earth observation data. So Fiji's ministries have set up GIS units. They are using remote sensing and data to make decisions, to design projects, including NDMO. One example I can give is the Common Sensing Project, which is a collaborative project with UNITAR, UNOSAT, Commonwealth, UK Space Agency, and currently it's being funded by the Norwegian government. And through that project, Fiji was able to do sea level rise modeling, do hazard mapping, and also for the seawalls project, actually identify the location of where seawalls are best suited in terms of the cost effectiveness, as well as the area which has the least hazard exposure. So these kind of tools help in decision making as well as in proposal development. And through the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, write shops are being held, where part of the training, which includes proposal development, has a module on Earth observation so that people can use this information to develop robust proposals and submit for climate finance. Then coming to the last point, which is innovative financing. Fiji government has issued green bonds and blue bonds previously, and some of that money has been used to finance infrastructure. When Cyclone Winston hit, there were schools that were damaged, and the money from green bonds was used to rehabilitate and rebuild the schools to be more disaster resilient. The blue bonds are also financing blue towns and sustainable cities and infrastructure for water treatment and wastewater treatment. And Fiji has also, I think Fiji is the first country, at least in the Pacific, to have set up a climate relocation of communities trust fund. It's called the CROC Trust Fund. And it is a fund into which government puts in some of the taxes, and then bilateral funders and others also put in money. And this is used to relocate communities that have exhausted all adaptation options, and they've come to the last option of actually having to relocate. And so the fund provides money to build houses and other amenities for the community as they relocate. 6 communities have already been relocated, and 42 are waiting to be relocated. To summarize, Fiji has done quite a lot, but the need is always much more. There is the National Infrastructure Investment Plan, which needs millions and billions. The NDC itself needs 1.98 billion to implement. But when you look at infrastructure, it is something where we can synergize climate finance, disaster risk finance, and development finance, so that when we build, whatever infrastructure we build, it is climate-proof, disaster safe, and provides development gains. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa, and very insightful, and all the work that the government is doing. I think the three examples which you took had a lot to learn, and I think these also are something which can be replicated in all island nations, especially the blue bonds and the blue economy, and the enhancement of, putting in finance for these adaptation and resilient infrastructure will also lead to several benefits. And this panel has brought out many of these success stories, and I think the tracking of those benefits is something that will enhance more finance to come into this space. And thank you so much for your views, and it beautifully tucks it into the next speaker. We have Savina with us, who I would like to bring in the aspects of how to involve communities and gender into this A&R financing, and how the communities, what kind of roles do you envisage for impacted communities, and how do you integrate the gender elements into any development that is taking place through adaptation and resilience finance. So over to you, Savina, for bringing in
Thank
your
you,
views.
Ashish. I'll start by going off script slightly, but very ever so slightly. Just to bring a bit more of a perspective from someone who's from the engineering community. I'm from the implementers, so we are the ones that you turn to ask what works and what doesn't, and we've got all the knowledge of infrastructure performance, what's worked in the past. What we need to be getting better at is showing the value and the benefits, quantifying benefits delivered by specific solutions, and also as a community, and using our sort of credibility as technical experts, flag the solutions that have got the highest potential for scalability. So that's something that I am really keen to work with all of the stakeholders, because as you said at the start, we need to establish that ecosystem. And I'd love for the technical community, the engineering community, to be involved in discussions with financiers, with policymakers a bit earlier on, so that we can bring our technical input to the table and unlock finance, and help unlock finance. Now, onto the question that you asked me about gender equality, social inclusion, that is called GESI for short, as an acronym. I'll make 3 points, and I'll be brief because the clock is ticking. I can see the clock ticking. But key points. So first of all, the inclusion of these communities that are marginalized and vulnerable, such as women, girls, elderly people, people with disability, vulnerable communities, indigenous communities. I think that is a moral imperative. So this is something, there is a moral imperative not to leave anyone behind in anything that we do in terms of investment and implementation of climate resilience and adaptation. That's kind of should be first thing. When I talk about considering GESI, so gender equality, social inclusion, I don't just mean protecting these vulnerable communities. I also mean working with them, involving them in every step of the decision making. I talk about empowering them, connecting them to job opportunities. So really kind of making them adapt, and also through this help them change their behavior, you know, like in terms of they can contribute, they make a real contribution. Because if you think about, we're thinking about resilience of a system, resilience of infrastructure assets, services, but people. So resilience of people, and kind of building that. The second point is, and a focus on the how-to, because that's alongside my engineering pragmatism. So to embed this type of approach, I think this needs to be systemically managed across all stages of the life cycle. So this is not something that you can just tag at the end, and it shouldn't be just a box-ticking exercise, which sometimes it is the case. Because these communities do have a role to play, can bring value, can actually, through their local knowledge, inform what needs to be done. They know what needs to be done, what they need. And then just, you know, like making a small comment on how, what next? What could be done next? So I think in the context of climate resilience and adaptation, obviously in making finance and investment decisions, including indicators that truly represent, you know, like that are based on disaggregated data, assessments of the situation, so that they're not generic. You have like indicators that can be measured, and then ask the community for feedback on whether that has been really achieved, feed it back into the decision making for investment, and that can be a positive feedback loop. And then one final recommendation for me would be developing, unless this already exists, but developing a toolkit for including gender equality and social inclusion. So the consideration of the marginalized and vulnerable communities toolkit that looks at across all the stages of the life cycle and learns from practice. So this is not a new thing. You know, it's been done in pockets, but hasn't been done systematically. So by creating this, perhaps something that CDRI could consider.
Thank you so much, Savina, and very important point. To build the ecosystem, the communities need to be at the forefront, and they're the ones who are the most impacted. In fact, I'm from a very small little town called Mangalore, which is a coastal town in India. And very recently, we'd been to for some studies, and 70% of the fisher folks were women, and they had all the ideas on how to deal with the ghost nets. And these are the aspects. The local knowledge lies with the communities, and especially women, and they need to be in the forefront, and that can be one of the key things that can also be then tied into the indicators and the toolkit itself. And I think these are very important points, and definitely we will take it forward going on from here to make this ecosystem live, as well as move towards action, as Auguste pointed out in his opening remarks. And I think now we are ready for Sujit for his views on adaptation, resilient finance. Congratulations on the fantastic report which you have recently published, and it gives quite a lot of data, pointers, and as well as some recommendations. I would like to hear more from you, and we'll also use this your pointers to actually sum up all the discussions we have had. So I would like to request you to also do the same in the interest of the time. Over to you, Sujit.
Thank you very much, Ashish. And thanks for also introducing me as a know-it-all guy, which I'm not, even close to it. Of course, we learn every day in our work. See, the issue is that all of us who are there, who are in this room, all we wish to reduce risk, adapt to climate change impacts. But unfortunately, I think we are not yet there. And all, evidence shows that it's a moving target. I mean, there are, I think, evidence which says by 2030, the events, climate-related, disasters and events related to climate could increase by 40%, which means 1.5, a day, which really triggers the thinking that are we doing enough? And essentially, I think I would say that are we really investing in resilience, in climate resilience? As you mentioned in the beginning, all investments, irrespective of whether it's climate financing, whether it's whatever development financing, all should be climate resilience. Makes perfect sense, but is it really happening? I think our colleague from World Bank really very eloquently, put forward the financing gaps, the challenges, and I think what we heard is that almost 90% of only the climate financing goes to mitigation, and only 10% to adaptation. On top of that, I think when we look at investment from public and private, there is definitely always a call from increasing private sector investment. And when you look at the number, it's actually just 1% of that big climate financing portfolio into adaptation. It's absolutely nowhere close to what is needed. Now, this I think we have been hearing about it. In fact, the midterm review of the Sendai framework, when all member states came together to review, they said, yes, we are far from that, and they really very strongly called for private sector investments, increasing private sector investment. Now, the question, I think, is not just about making a call of increased private sector investment. It's about how do you prepare them? How do you prepare the private sector to really, invest? Because for private sector, we all know, those who have been working in the UN or in the public sector, there is definitely a language barrier. Language barrier in the sense the way they look at things is different from perhaps the way we look at things. There has to be a common language. They have to understand what does that, adaptation investment means in a very practical manner. And that brings me to, our effort, to develop a very practical guide with the private sector. It's not a UN guide as such. It's done by KPMG and Standard Chartered with a bunch of other, I think 20 other organizations. Really those who are in the industry, they know the language, and then we came in to really provide that support to develop a common language of investment. As you know, UNDRR as a UN entity, looking at disaster risk reduction, we predominantly deal with member states. That's our core, that's our, core job. Having said that, there is a felt gap that this, engagement of private sector is essential. Increasing investment, in resilience is essential, and that's why we join hand to develop this. Now, this practical, as I said, practical guide is essentially to, trigger action. It's not a conceptual document. It's a very practical guide. I think, it's available on the internet if you look at it. It really clearly spells out through very specific examples. There are more than, I think, 100 examples of what is an investable, project means for them, for the private sector, and what are those key impact indicators that will allow them to measure that investment. I think this will allow them to articulate, the big investors to really articulate where to invest. Because this question we found always, difficult, that if we don't give such understanding, it will be difficult to, increase that investment aspect. So we have been, as UNDRR, apart from our engagement with the governments, we have been very, closely involved with the private sector. We have an investors advisory board, those who continuously work with us to develop this, this kind of common language. We also join hand with the Climate Bonds Initiative, the CBI, to develop the taxonomy, which is, I think, the work is still in progress. There are, I just colleagues informed me that there are a lot of interest coming from governments, and it's like from Brazil asking us to support them, assist them in issuing bonds, and that requires this kind of technical knowledge and work, which also has to come from private sector. So this is essentially our private sector engagement with the Investor Advisory Board, with CBI and others, to really help facilitate a process that will allow this increase in adaptation funding. And I think as I said, I think it's really challenging, but we have to keep on doing that. I mean, if we really want to reach a stage where we can say we are kind of influencing these investment decisions, I think we'll be somewhere we can say we're getting there to be successful. And I think that's the call. I mean, and of course, colleagues who talked about community engagement, inclusion. These are at the end. That's where we want to reach, and we have to bring them all that together, to see that there's adequate financing available, so that we are reaching the last mile, and we are doing effectively what we are supposed to do. So I will stop there, Assis. I think the time up slide is up there. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, thank you so much, Sujit. And you started by saying that, the aspect of mitigation financing receiving 80% of all climate finance. And I think what we don't realize is all the mitigation projects and interventions need to be climate resilient. And I think that is the aspect which we need to really drill down into everyone's mind, that, and that's only possible through reports such as yours. And, to come up with something which can let resilience rise up the adaptation and resilience finance should actually be over encompassing all the financing that goes in, because at the end of the day, it's just not enough only doing mitigation, because that needs to be resilient. It needs to be not affected by climate change in the future. I think it's slowly dawning, but we will keep enhancing this storyline over and over again through our work, getting everything into action. And and I would request for a round of applause to the fantastic panelists over here for having brought all their knowledge onto this, and going forward, we will keep doing this work. Thank you so much. We will have one group photo, and also there are certificates, 3 certificates, which will be provided. So please do come. Thank you.